Welcome to the podcast for Westside, a Jesus Church. We hope this teaching encourages and empowers you to love, learn, and live the way of Jesus.
If you were here last week, Phil and Diane taught us through Ruth chapter 3. And by the way, it was such a great message. It was hilarious, too. If you missed it, go online, check out the podcast on iTunes, and catch up with it. But they left us on a cliffhanger, because what we saw in chapter 3 was that Ruth and Boaz are deeply in love. And yet Boaz, kind of typical guy here, hadn't really done anything about it. He's moving kind of slow, maybe some cold feet or whatever, so to speak. You know the story, how she took part of the blanket away. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, she then decided, you know what, we've got to do something about this. She's this amazing mother-in-law. She's like, you know what, Boaz is moving too slow. Ruth, it's time to have a DTR, define the relationship. Let's figure out where he stands. And so she concocts this plan that to us kind of seems weird. Ruth sneaks up to Boaz while he's asleep, takes off some of his blanket, and lays down at his feet. Now, imagine how weird that must have been for poor Boaz. I mean, he wakes up, and earlier this year, or this week, I looked at the King James version of how it put it, and it was awesome, just quintessential King James. It says, "And it came to pass that Boaz was afraid, for behold, a woman lay at his feet." Right? In other words, Boaz is trying to figure out, what did I drink last night? Like, I don't remember this. This is weird. But this is what we need to know. This is important. In the ancient world, laying down at someone's feet like that was actually a form of proposing marriage. Boaz had a choice to make. What's he going to do here? If he told her to go away, that meant, you know what, too much too soon. I need some time, I need some space, not now. Or he could decide right then and there, yes, let's get married. And that, as we saw last week, is that what Boaz decides. He's like, sure, let's do this. But there's one problem. And what's the problem? Well, there was another guy. We saw that there was a man who legally, in that culture, and we'll explain this in a sec, but in that culture, he had legal rights to marry her before Boaz. Now, where does that come from? Leviticus chapter 25, it says that if a husband dies in that culture, the next closest male relative had the responsibility to step in, to marry her, to take care of her and her family. And that sounds so bizarre to us, but the reason that was done in that culture is because it was an agrarian society. In that culture, men were the primary breadwinners, which meant that if you were not married, if you were single or a widow, it left you in a very vulnerable and destitute place. And so to protect the women in that culture, they said, okay, we don't want a woman to be left without any resources, so it's the responsibility of what they called the guardian redeemer or the kinsman redeemer to step in and provide. Now, Boaz knew that law. And there's Ruth laying at his feet, and he's like, I'd love to marry you, but there's another guy. Now, things always get complicated when there's another guy. And that's what we're going to see in this chapter. Let's start. You guys ready for Ruth 4? All right, verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate, and he sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. And Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. And Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of the seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." And check out what the guy says. He says, "I will redeem it." Now, Boaz is really eager to get closure here. He wants to figure out, how's this going to work, and is it even possible to marry Ruth? So first thing in the morning, he gets up and he goes down to the city center, the town gate. This was, in the ancient world, where all the business transactions took place. It was a place where legal transactions happened. It was where the movers, the shakers, the influencers of the town, they'd meet together, they'd network together. And Boaz, he sees the guardian redeemer, and he calls out to him. He says, "Come over here, my friend." Now, that phrase, my friend, is a loaded term culturally, because in that culture, you wouldn't call someone my friend if you were close to them. If you knew them well, if you're on a first name basis, you just call them by their name. You wouldn't just call them my friend. It was more a term of, well, we're acquaintances, maybe we see each other at the marketplace or whatever, but I don't really know you all that well. It's kind of like what we do with Facebook, right? We have friends, but you may or may not know them. You may or may not even know anything about their story. Or if someone comes up to you and they're like, "Hey, buddy," or "Hey, pal," typically, if someone calls you that, it means they're probably not that close to you. You usually don't call your best friend buddy. Maybe your dog, that works, right? So my friend was just kind of like, come over, acquaintance, have a seat. Now, I was in Israel a few years back, had a chance to do a conference near Gaza, which is an amazing place. And our last day there, we went to the old city of Jerusalem. Has anyone been to the old city of Jerusalem? Okay, like 3 of you. It's a fascinating place. There's this old part of the city where the streets are super narrow, and it's filled with all of these shops and marketplaces. And if you've ever gone down those streets, I remember the first time I went, it was really overwhelming because it's really noisy, and the guys are like super intense when it comes to negotiation and all of that. And so they're calling out to you, "Hey, my friend, my friend, my friend." This is like a Middle Eastern thing. "My friend, come over here, come buy this camel," or whatever. And so you're walking by, and it takes forever just to get through because they're literally like yelling at you and shouting at you, calling you my friend, my friend. Well, one guy actually grabbed me and he pulled me inside of his shop. He's like, "My friend, you need this porcelain camel." Pulls me inside the shop, which is crazy. I mean, imagine doing that. I think we should try that for church. That would actually work, right? Just grab him. So he pulls me inside the store, and he was like the most ruthless negotiator ever. He's like, "You need this porcelain camel, my friend." I'm like, "No, I don't." And he's like, "Yes, you do." And he was so effective at the art of the deal that I ended up walking out with 5 porcelain camels, right? See, that's what a good negotiator can do. They know how to craft the situation. They know how to come up with some kind of deal. Now, some of you are wired that way. I'm definitely not. But some of you are wired that way. You can sell anyone on anything. You know how to negotiate. You know how to drive a bargain. Someone told me a story this last week. I think it was out in Washington, D.C., where there's a restaurant, and the owner of the restaurant, he wanted to have this challenge. It was kind of draw attention to the restaurant. And what he did, he's a big guy, he works out a ton. He said, "Okay, I'm going to take this lemon. I'm going to squeeze all the lemon juice out of the lemon, and then I'll hand it off to whoever wants to try. And if anyone can squeeze even one more drop of lemon juice out of the lemon, I will give them $1,000. So it drew all this attention. People are coming, great big guys, and the guy squeezes every drop out, hands it off to the next guy. He couldn't do it. The next guy, he couldn't do it. The next guy, he couldn't do it. An hour later, they were done. No one had been able to do it until this guy shows up out of the blue, super skinny, had like really thick glasses. He's like, "Let me try." And so they're all looking at him. He grabs the lemon. He squeezes it. 4 drops of lemon juice come out. And everyone's just stunned. Like, "Are you a lumberjack? How did you do this?" He said, "No." He said, "I work for the IRS. Now, if you work for the IRS, I am totally joking, right? I hope you know that. Some people they know how to do it. They know how to negotiate. They know how to get people to do what they want to do. And this is Boaz. We've talked about all the good sides of Boaz, but we're going to see, too, there's kind of a sneaky side as well. He calls over his friend. "Come over here, my friend, sit down." He brings the 10 elders of the town. He's like, "Hey, Naomi, she's selling the land that belonged to her husband. You're the closest relative. You have now first dibs. If you want to redeem the land, you can have the land." And the relative's like, "Yes, that sounds amazing. Of course I want some more land." But then Boaz says, and this is where we see the negotiator, he's like, "Well, there's a catch." What's the catch? Verse 5, Boaz said, On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow. Just a slight little small print, right? Okay, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, crickets, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Talk about a 180. I mean, at first, he's so excited. Yeah, there's land, there's property. And Boaz is like, okay, but if you want the property, you have to marry Ruth. And legally, she came with her mother-in-law, Naomi. So you'll get another mother-in-law as well. Take care of her. And he's like, I don't need it. So he's backing up real quick, right? I won't say anything there because my mother-in-law comes to this church. Now, just the way that this is written, there's all kinds of subtle hints about what the author of this book thought about this unnamed relative. First of all, the fact that he's unnamed tells us a thing or two about him. But secondly, he comes across like kind of cold and calculated. He wants the resources, but he doesn't want any responsibility. He wants the land, but he's not interested in sacrificial love. He wants property, but he doesn't want the person. The law actually mandated, hey, it's your responsibility. You're to take care of her. You're to provide for her. But he's like, nah, I don't really need it. It might endanger my estate. He wasn't willing to do anything to help. He's ruthless, which I guess that works. That's so awesome. That actually works. Total accident, that one, but it just like flows, like the Spirit of God comes down. If you didn't get that, see me afterwards or go to the prayer room. Now you compare that with the character of Boaz, right? Boaz goes out of his way, he provides for Ruth, he's generous, he sacrifices, he loves them. Now, here's the word that we need to write down because 2 weeks ago I shared this with you. It is one of the most significant words in all the book of Ruth, and it is the word chesed. Chesed. Chesed, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, is one of the pivotal words in all the Jewish Old Testament, mentioned 150 times. It is a key theme to the book of Ruth. If you ever go back and study Ruth, you've got to study it through this lens. Chesed means active, selfless, sacrificial care and love. Chesed is a love that gives and it keeps on giving. That's what's going on here. Boaz is willing to sacrifice. Boaz is willing to do whatever he could do to provide for Ruth and her mother-in-law. And he is going out of his way, way out of his way, even at the cost of what that could mean socially and culturally. He's choosing love. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, he spoke of this kind of love. He said, love always protects, and it always trusts, and it always hopes, and it always perseveres. Love never fails. Isn't it true that when you see that kind of love, not mushy Hallmark infatuation, when you see that kind of love, genuine love, true love, isn't it the most beautiful thing you could ever see? I mean, it is so inspiring. It's so captivating. A few months ago, my wife and I, we sat down with someone, and she shared with us her story, and heartbreaking story. She made some serious mistakes in her walk with God and in her marriage as well. And her husband, a lot of people were pressuring him, hey, you need to leave her, you need to divorce her. And on paper, he had every right to. But he chose not to. And he said, you know what? I'm going to love you. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to pray for you. And I'm going to pray that someday you could encounter this Jesus who has changed my life. He was so taken back by that. Just what? Why would you show me that? That makes no sense. And he said, explain it to me. And she said, it's because of the Lord. And he's like, well, tell me about this Lord. Who is he? And she invites him onto church. He starts coming to church because he was so blown away by what forgiveness looks like. It was just a few months ago, he ends up giving his life to Jesus here. And God has healed their marriage, and he has restored them and is working in their life. That's what Hesed looks like. Chesed is when you have every right to go, but instead I'm choosing to stay. Chesed is like the couple that I was talking to earlier this year when the doctors were pressuring them to abort. Abort, there's no hope. Abort, there might be issues. Abort, but they choose instead to keep the child and love the child. Chesed is when you choose commitment over emotion. Chesed is when you find out something about someone's past and they think you're going to walk away, but you choose instead to keep on loving them. Stephen Kundrick, he is a filmmaker and producer. He said, love is not determined by the one being loved, but by the one choosing to love. Isn't that good? Fake love walks away when times are tough, but true love, chesed, chooses to stay and fight. And that's what I love about Boaz. That's why he's a man's man. He's like, you know what? I'm going to fight for her. I'm going to fight for this family. I'm going to do what I know God has called me to do. Now, verse 7, in earlier times in Israel, this is where it kind of gets even weirder, as if it wasn't already. For the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transaction in Israel. So you take off your sandal, you give it to someone. This was their American Express, okay? Take it. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandals. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kelon, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with this property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. And then the elders and all the people, so this is their wedding ceremony, at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman. May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, check this out. The guardian redeemer, the closest relative, he says, you know what? You can have the land. I don't need to get married to Ruth. And so to make the whole thing legal, takes off his sandal, gives it to Boaz. Now, if I could just call out the elephant in the room for a second. I know when we read passages like this, and for that matter, all of the book of Ruth, and for that matter, most of the Bible, you see things, cultural traditions, cultural customs, especially in the Old Testament, where it causes you to pause and scratch your head like, what is going on? It just seems so antiquated sometimes, or difficult to understand, or think of where we are in 2017 and how we do things versus all the things we've seen in the book of Ruth. I mean, think about the way that they, quote, dated. She's in the field. Boaz is like, wow, beautiful woman. I need to date her. And he then brings her grain. That was their version of asking someone out. The kinsman redeemer laws, just, wow, that's odd. That's strange. We don't do that. The whole thing of cover me with the corner of your blanket as a version of asking someone to marry you. And then giving someone your sandal. I mean, let's face it. These things are kind of strange. It seems foreign to us. It's hard for us to understand. But here's the deal. When you study cultures and when you study history, and this is why I love history, and I know so many of you do too, is that you see different mindsets and perspectives and ways of doing things. I, for one, am so glad that all the world is not like suburban America. Now, in some ways, it kind of feels that way. Thomas Friedman, he wrote that book, The World is Flat. And by that, he meant that things now, wherever you go in the world, are beginning to feel the same because of globalization and internet and technology. So I was in Europe last month, and there are parts in Europe, it feels like you're in Beaverton. There's a Starbucks and there's a Walmart. It's like, wow, what's happening? But I'm still so thankful that there are parts of the world that are different, that are unique, and that have different culture and customs and ways of doing things. I used to be a teacher in the South Pacific and talk about different traditions and customs. Living in the jungle, I was there for 3 years. And I had to learn things, just the way that they did relationships and some of their customs. It seemed so foreign to me. And honestly, there were times where it felt really offensive to me, really bizarre. For example, I found this out about 6 months after living there, that if a guy in one village falls in love with a woman in another village, in Vanuatu, what they do is the man, if he wants to marry her, he has to go to the father of this girl, talk to him, and if he agrees, if he's like, okay, yes, you can marry my daughter, then what happens in Vanuatu is the man who wants to marry her has to take 3 pigs, and he has to give them to his prospective father-in-law. And that was the way you kind of seal the deal. And I remember hearing about that. I'm like, that is so bizarre. It's so weird. And once he's got the 3 pigs, he's like, all right, get married, go for it. And that's just the way they did things. Now, what was even more offensive to me and really hard to figure out was, true story, when guys saw a girl that they thought was really attractive, because the typical rate, who knows what it is now with inflation, but back then it was 3 pigs. Then, if they saw someone they thought was beautiful or had really good character, he would say to her, you are a 4-pig woman. And I remember just like, what did you say? Are you kidding me? Right? And she's smiling. She's grinning ear to ear like, thank you so much. That is so, and I remember talking to those guys. They're like, no, that's how we compliment one another. That's how you say nice things to someone you think's really attractive. Now, tip, guys, it doesn't work now. I tried this on my wife. I got in a lot of trouble. No, just kidding. Right? But we look at that, we're like, this is weird. This is bizarre. It's offensive sometimes. But we need to realize, too, this is 3,000 years ago. Now, let me take it a step further. I would argue that 3,000 years from now, the anthropologists of the future, the sociologists of the future, will look at the way that we do things and look at the way that we do relationships. And I think we will be the weird ones. I mean, just imagine, 3,000 years from now, you're an anthropologist, and you're getting your fellow anthropologists together, and you're like, okay, you gotta check out this culture. They lived 3,000 years ago in a place called Portland, and the way they did things back then, in fact, you guys heard of Banksy, the urban street artist? Banksy, he tweeted this photo a couple days ago that summarizes the American relationship. I think he's nailed it right here, right? So you're the anthropologist of the future. You're looking back, you're like, okay, this is how they did things back then. In that culture, they loved 2 things. They loved their smartphones, their devices, the art of distraction, right? And secondly, they loved themselves. They were all about themselves. And so what happened in that culture 2,000 years ago is they married those 2 things together, the smartphone and love for self, and the love child was called the selfie. They just loved, they loved selfies. And they would force people to look at their selfies on social media. So you couldn't get through your scroll without seeing more selfies. And some people who really, really wanted to date, they would take their selfie and they would put it on an app. And the way that they picked out a date is swipe right. And they find someone that they like, and they choose that person. But Christians didn't like that app very much, and so they came up with their own called Christian Mingle, but that was just weird. And then the guy would take a very expensive rock and give it to her, and then they'd send a letter to all their friends demanding that they give them presents. What? So you're the anthropologists of the future. We're the weird ones. That's the point. So when we look at these stories and we study the Bible, I know our first instinct is like, this is bizarre, this is weird. But I think, honestly, like every culture has its own strange nuances. So they exchange sandals. Here you go. Okay, that's how we do things. And the elders of the city, what do? They pronounce a blessing over Ruth and Naomi. Now, this is important. The blessing in ancient Near East culture, especially in Jewish culture, was everything. And it's really sad how we use the term blessing as kind of Christianese. God bless you or whatever. It's a word that we throw out. Doesn't mean a whole lot to us. But in Jewish culture, the blessing was everything. The blessing was God's favor. The blessing was God's promise. The blessing was God's shalom. When they spoke the blessing, they believed that the power of life and death is in the tongue. So at this wedding ceremony, the elders, the leaders, they bless them. May the Lord make you like Ruth or Rachel and Leah. They were famous in Israel, leaders in Israel. May you have standing in our city. And in verse 12, may you have lots of kids. And that part happened. Keep reading, verse 13. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son, honeymoon baby, right here. And the woman said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Now, what I love about that, it's the women speaking this of Naomi. Naomi, you are an amazing mother-in-law, better than 7 sons. And what does Naomi do? She took the child in her arms and she cared for him. So she's a grandma now. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of who? Of David. So this is how the book of Ruth ends. Now, a couple thoughts before we come to the table. Do you remember 3 weeks ago, we started the book of Ruth, and I started it with kind of a warning saying, you know what, this chapter is going to be really dark and depressing. And we went through Ruth chapter 1, and we saw, sure enough, famine. A family was forced to leave. They lose their home. Almost everyone dies. There's tears. There's heartbreak. They then, in desperation, move back to Israel, no money, no resources. And Naomi, who Naomi in Hebrew means sweet, she changes her name. She's like, call me Mara. Mara means bitter. I mean, everything about the chapter is super Eeyore, right? It's like a Christopher Nolan movie. It's dark, it's brooding, there's a ticking clock in the background. But notice how the story ends. Notice chapter 4. The book begins with brokenness, and it ends with what? Blessing. It begins with tears, weeping, and it ends with joy. It begins with bitterness, and it ends with hope. It begins questioning God. God, why did you allow this? Why is this happening? And it ends worshiping God. It begins with death, and it ends with new life. There's a reason why the book concludes with a genealogy. Obed was their first child. Obed was the grandfather of David, who became one of the best kings and rulers in all of Israel, a man after God's own heart, a man who wrote the book of Psalms, a man who led the people forward in their pursuit of the Messiah. And it's not just David. As you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, worth writing down, Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, you have the genealogy of Jesus. Question, who is in the genealogy of Jesus? Ruth and Obed and David. Jesus chose a woman who was a widow from Moab. We've talked about the Moabites. The Moabites were arch enemies of Israel. Think North Korea or ISIS. God takes who the Israelites hated and who the Moabites hated the Israelites, and he says, I'm going to take the least likely person, and I'm going to make her central to my plan to redeem and restore the world. Because of this relationship, because of this story, we see Messiah, Jesus, coming into the world to save it. So at its core, then, the book of Ruth is about God's power to redeem any story. The book of Ruth is about God's power to redeem any story. And it's not just Ruth. I mean, this is central to really all of the Old Testament. And this idea of redemption is central to all of Scripture. Scripture begins with light, but then there's darkness. But at the end in Revelation, there is light once again. Did you know that in Jewish culture, the way that they set up their days is complete reversal from ours? So our days, our morning begins, it's light, and then the day gets progressively darker and darker and darker. The Jewish people historically have reversed that, and they say, actually, our day will begin with sunset. So it starts dark, but then it gets progressively lighter and lighter and lighter. Why did they do that? It was a worldview statement. It was a way to say, you know what, things may be dark now, but in the end, God will have the last word. Ruth is about how God can take a broken, dark, messed up story and bring hope and healing and renewal and redemption and reconciliation. It is a book that puts on display the power of God to redeem anyone and anything. Remember, we started in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Now, most of us know that verse. 3 verses later is another promise. Paul writes, if God be for us, who can be against us? Isn't that verse awesome? In fact, why don't we just say this together, video venue as well. Let's just, in a loud voice, speak this promise out. 1, 2, 3. If God be for us, who can be against us? Now, I know some of us think, Dom, there's a lot that's against me right now, right? My relationship, my job, my unemployment, sickness, cancer, anxiety, depression. But this is what we need to know, is that God does not promise that we won't be broken by life. The Bible's very honest about that. Yeah, we'll be broken, but he does promise that he will someday put us back together. Paul said, we see through a glass dimly. Things are dark right now, but a day is coming we'll see face to face. A day is coming when all things will be made clear. All will be made right. We will see the beauty of what God has been doing all along. So last Monday was the eclipse. How many of you saw the eclipse? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you saw the full eclipse, like the full deal? Okay, show hands. Wasn't that epic? That seriously was the most amazing experience. One of the most amazing experiences I've ever seen. My friend and I, Tom Baker, he's a leader here at Westside. We drove down to McMinnville, and we found this field, and surprisingly, there's only a handful of people. We set up our cameras. Tom's like this master photographer, so he helps like get my camera all set up and shows me the right settings and all of that. And it was bizarre, the whole experience. So the day gets darker and darker. And wasn't the colors? That was fascinating. It was like this muted kind of color where it almost felt like the sun was wearing sunglasses or something. And then do you notice too how things got cooler? I don't know how much cooler it went, but it felt like at least 10 degrees or so. And then there were some animals that kind of were acting weird and stuff. And then in that moment, if you saw the whole thing, if you're in the path of totality, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. The world just went dark. You could see the stars. There were even a few planets. And so we're there just taking photos. I wanted to share with you one of the pictures I took. So this was that moment of totality. And I shouldn't have done it at this point, but I actually took off my glasses. That's why I can't see any of you today. But it was amazing because you have the moon that's just right there, and it's like this kind of hanging, this orb in the sky, and it's dark, but then you just see these wisps of bright, radiant light just going all around it. Here's the second one I took. This is one of my favorites because if you look closely, you can actually see some of the fire up there in the right-hand part of it. And then finally, and it felt like maybe, 30 seconds, I think it was more like 2 minutes, the sun started coming back. And here's the last one I took. And so at that point, I grabbed my glasses and put them back on. But it felt like just a short, tiny window of just, it took my breath away. It was so stunning. And then all of a sudden, the light, the beauty comes back. That is how the Jewish people saw the world. The world begins with light. Let there be light. God speaks over all of creation, and all was beautiful. But then there was sin and brokenness and death and disease and boy bands. All of that happened in Genesis, right? The world was fractured and broken, but God says, I'm going to restore the world. I'm going to heal the world. I'm going to make it new. And the Son of God, Jesus, comes to the world to restore. John 1, he is the light of the world. And the message of Scripture is, yes, you may be in a place of darkness now. Yes, you may be walking through the shadows now. Yes, you may be hurting. Yes, you may be hopeless and struggling with sin or addiction or confusion or anxiety, but a day is coming when this God will put you and this world back together. That is the heart of the gospel. And what a difference that is from other worldviews. I think, for example, of atheism, that the message of atheism is it's eclipsed, it's dark, there is no hope, there is no ultimate purpose in life, so deal with it. I was reading this last week, Nietzsche, which I don't recommend unless you want to be depressed. I was reading through Nietzsche, and he actually says this. He says, there's no God. He says, we stare into the abyss stares into us. He says, there is no purpose. And then he says, we're like mosquitoes. He said, we're fidgety, we're just flighty, and then in a moment, we disappear. Try living your life as if that were true. But the God of the Bible pushes back and says, no, that is not the end of the story. The light of God is coming. The Son of God will return. All things will be made new. We see through a glass dimly right now, but someday we will see face to face. Someday God will restore. And maybe you're in that place right now. You're in a space of breakup or confusion or heartache or bankruptcy. And I just want to share with you today, the light of God is coming. God will heal. God will restore. God will make all things new. That is the book of Ruth, and that is the message of the gospel. Carolyn James Custis, she has this line in her book on Ruth. She said, the book ends in a way that we do not expect. Boaz and our heroine Ruth are gone from sight, a clear indication that this book is something other than a romance. In the end, only the old woman is left, holding the child who is her future and that of her people. The birth of Obed is a picture of the gospel, suffering and sacrifice, the joy of renewed life, and hope for the future, all mingled together. This is the gospel of Ruth.